Whispers of the Ancients, Episode 12, the Hausa City-States, Walls of Power approximately 1000 to 1800 CE. Across the parched earth of the soul, between the Sahara and the greener lands of the savannah, rose a constellation of fortified cities, silent sentinels in the dust. These were the Hausa City-States, born of trade, tempered by war and guided by tradition. Their walls enclosed more than just homes and markets. They safeguarded stories, ideas, and an enduring African spirit. Segment 1. Birth of the Hausa world. Long before the arrival of Arabic script, long before camel caravans carved trails into the desert, legends spoke of Bayajida, the foreign prince who came from the east and slew a serpent that terrorized the city of Dora. In return, he married the local queen and fathered the 7 sons who would become the founders of the Hausa. Bakwai, or 7 Hausa, the core kingdoms of a people destined to dominate the savannah. Whether myth or metaphor, this tale reflects the dual origin of Hausa society, a fusion of indigenous African cultures and foreign influences. Archaeological evidence reveals that by the 10th century CE, Hausa-speaking peoples had already begun developing a network of urban settlements throughout what is now northern Nigeria and southern Niger. Each city-state such as Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Zazzau, Goba, Dora, Rono, and Byron grew from a shared linguistic and cultural foundation, but evolved unique identities, political systems, and economic specialties. Segment 2. Fortresses in the savannah. The most iconic feature of the Hausa city-states was their walls. Constructed from earth and later reinforced with mud brick and stone, the city walls could stretch for miles, encircling hundreds of acres. They were not merely defensive structures, but also symbolic boundaries separating the sacred city from the wild, the known from the unknown. These walls, particularly in cities like Kano, were architectural marvels, wide enough for cavalry to patrol their tops and studded with gates controlled by elite warriors. Inside the city, winding alleys, grand mosques, central markets, and noble compounds formed a dense tapestry of life. Segment 3. The merchants and the monsoon winds. Though landlocked, the Hausa states became key players in long-distance trade. Their position at the southern fringe of the Sahara allowed them to act as intermediaries between North Africa and sub-Saharan societies. Caravans bearing salt, cloth, and dates from Morocco and Libya crossed the desert, where they met Hausa merchants offering gold, slaves, leather goods, dyed cloths, and especially the famed indigo textiles of Kano. These brightly dyed fabrics became a signature product of Hausa artisanship, valued far beyond their borders. Markets buzzed with the clamor of haggling voices and the rhythmic calls to prayer. Trade routes crisscrossed the savannah, transforming cities like Katsina and Kano into cosmopolitan hubs with diverse populations. Segment 4. Faith and the flow of ideas. Islam had arrived in West Africa centuries earlier via North African traders and missionaries. But in the Hausa city-states, its growth was gradual and multifaceted. By the 14th century, many elites had adopted the faith, building mosques and sending their sons to study the Quran and Arabic law. However, Islam in Hausa lands existed alongside indigenous beliefs, shrines to local spirits, festivals honoring ancestral deities, and the consultation of diviners remained integral to daily life, particularly among rural populations. The resulting syncretic culture blended Islamic jurisprudence with traditional kingship, fostering both cultural continuity and tension. For some, like the cleric Usman Dan Fodio in the late 18th century, this fusion was unacceptable and it would lead to transformative conflict. Segment 5. Artisans of ink and earth. Hausa society valued both oral and written traditions, while griots and professional bards preserved genealogies, myths, and praise songs. A growing scholarly class developed in cities like Katsina. Arabic manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and theology circulated through these centers of learning. Meanwhile, Hausa artisans left behind enduring material legacies, potteries crafted for both ritual and utility, calabash carvings inscribed with flowing patterns, bronze and iron works forged by blacksmiths who were both artisans and mystics. Architecture, too, reflected this blend of function and faith. Mosques built in Sudano-Sahelian style featured thick earthen walls, wooden beams protruding like ribs, and minarets shaped like termite mounds firmly rooted in African tradition, yet shaped by Islamic practice. Segment 6, Queens of Zazzau and the Politics of Power. Among the Hausa City-States, Zaria or Zazzau stood out for its warrior queens. Most famous among them was Queen Amina of Zazzau, said to have ruled in the 16th century. According to oral tradition, she was a formidable leader who commanded armies, expanded her kingdom, and built defensive walls around conquered cities. Queen Amina's reign challenges Western notions of patriarchal dominance in pre-colonial Africa. In reality, Hausa societies, while patriarchal in structure, granted women significant economic and even military roles, especially in markets and in certain ruling families. Women served as market regulators, priestesses, and in rare cases, sovereigns. These roles were grounded in Hausa cosmology, which acknowledged both masculine and feminine spiritual forces. Segment 7, Conflict and Consolidation. While united by language and culture, the Hausa states were often in competition. Warfare was frequent, driven by struggles over trade routes, agricultural land, and political prestige. The introduction of horses, brought from North Africa, transformed Hausa warfare. Cavalry units clad in chain mail thundered across the savannah, employing tactics learned from the Berbers and Arabs. City-states like Goba became known for their martial traditions. These internal rivalries, however, left the Hausa world vulnerable to external influences. Over time, Fulani pastoralists who had long lived among the Hausa began to exert religious and political pressure, culminating in a revolutionary upheaval. Segment 8, the Sokoto Caliphate and the end of independence. In 1804, a Fulani cleric named Usman Dan Fodio launched a jihad against the Hausa rulers, accusing them of corruption, impiety, and injustice. His movement quickly gained followers, toppling several Hausa states and establishing the Sokoto Caliphate, a powerful Islamic state that redefined the region. The jihad did not obliterate Hausa culture. Instead, it folded Hausa language, administration, and artisanship into a new religious political order. Cities like Kano and Katsina remained vital, now as centers of Islamic learning and power. By the time European colonizers arrived in the late 19th century, the Hausa city-states had already undergone profound transformation, yet their legacy endured in architecture, language, and the walls that still cast long shadows across the soul. Segment 9, the living legacy of the Hausa. Today, Hausa remains one of the most widely spoken languages in Africa, a lingua franca across West Africa. Modern cities like Kano retain echoes of their ancient past. Traditional dye pits, centuries-old mosques, and bustling markets continue to thrive. The Hausa cultural heritage is carried not only in language but in music, fashion, proverbs, and storytelling. From the folk tales of trickster spiders to the timeless praise poems of queens and warriors, the spirit of the city-states lives on. These were not merely cities walled in earth, they were walled in memory, tradition, and the collective strength of a people who carved civilization into the savannah. Segment 10, the legacy of queens and councils. The city-states of Hausaland, for all their outward resemblance, fortified walls, bustling markets, and spiritual cores hid within them deep variations in governance. Among the most remarkable aspects of this political fabric was the pivotal role of women in leadership and advisory capacities. Oral traditions and royal chronicles often speak of magajirs, powerful queen mothers or senior female officials who held sway over succession matters, diplomatic affairs, and even warfare. These women weren't merely ceremonial figures. In some city-states, like Zaria, named after Queen Zazzau, legendary matriarchs played foundational roles in both establishing and maintaining city power. The chronicles tell of Queen Amina of Zazzau, the warrior monarch who extended her city's dominion through military campaigns, building walls and trade routes that enhanced the region's prosperity. In the royal courts, councils often included women nobles, priestesses, and advisors whose wisdom in judicial and spiritual matters guided kings and sultans. These women were guardians of oral law, tradition, and ritual counterbalance to the military and economic strength exhibited by their male counterparts. Through their voices, the Hausa City-States harmonized the masculine and feminine energies in governance, a structure seldom seen in contemporaneous empires of the region. Segment 11. Islam and indigenous beliefs, a harmonious duality. Islam entered Hausaland, gradually introduced by Berber and Tuareg traders by the 11th century, and further reinforced by scholars and missionaries. Initially embraced by elite ruling classes, it slowly permeated every stratum of society, merging, as in many parts of Africa, with long-standing traditional beliefs rather than displacing them. This syncretism was visible in every aspect of life. In Kano, Katsina and Dora, mosques with mud brick minarets stood beside sacred groves, while Islamic judges, or alcalas, rendered decisions in tandem with customary courts. Arabic script was adopted for writing, house ushering in a literary culture that included poetry, theology, and history, but indigenous oral storytelling and praise songs remained prominent, delivered by griots and bards in native rhythms and idioms. This duality also shaped education. Islamic madrasas flourished, producing scholars who traveled to Timbuktu, Mecca, and Cairo. At the same time, children still learned folklore, herbal medicine, and clan histories from elders. This spiritual pluralism fostered a tolerant, intellectually vibrant society that could trade, worship, and negotiate across both African and Islamic worlds. Segment 12. The walls remember. The city walls, those formidable ramparts of mud, stone, and sand, remain today as mute but powerful witnesses of Hausa ingenuity and pride. Some, like the famous walls of Kano, stretched for over 20 kilometers and stood more than 10 meters high, built not just for defense but also to display power. These walls were expressions of unity and collective effort. Within these enclosures, society flourished. Artisan quarters produced exquisite leather goods, woven fabrics, indigo-dyed garments, and metalwork prized far beyond their borders. Wealthy homes with central courtyards and intricate carvings stood alongside humble huts, arranged in an urban layout that prioritized both beauty and functionality. These cityscapes were organized, not merely for security or aesthetics but to create order. Neighborhoods were often divided by craft or clan, with clear paths to markets, mosques, palaces, and wells. The design of the city was a statement of a society that valued cohesion, specialization, and a shared ownership of its destiny. Segment 13. Echoes of trade, whispers of change. As the 17th and 18th centuries unfolded, Hausaland found itself swept into wider currents of change. New trade routes bypassed older centers, and increasing European presence on the Atlantic coast began to shift economic dynamics. The trans-Saharan trade, once the lifeblood of the Hausa economy, was slowly eclipsed by coastal commerce controlled by foreign powers. The slave trade, too, cast a long and tragic shadow. While slavery had existed in Hausaland in various forms as prisoners of war, debt bondage, or social servitude, the transatlantic trade fueled by European demand introduced a brutal and dehumanizing scale. Raiding, depopulation, and conflict followed, altering the social fabric and laying the groundwork for future disruptions. At the same time, Islamic reform movements, like those led by the Fulani cleric Usman Dan Fodio in the early 19th century, criticized the perceived laxity and syncretism of the Hausa rulers. His jihad swept across the region, toppling city-state dynasties and folding them into the newly formed Sokoto Caliphate. Thus ended the era of independent Hausa city-states, though their cultural and architectural legacy would live on. Segment 14. The Sokoto Shadow and the Shape of Memory. The rise of the Sokoto Caliphate in the early 19th century dramatically restructured the political and religious landscape of Hausaland. Led by the reformer Usman Dan Fodio, a Fulani scholar and mystic, the movement sought to purify Islam in the region, rejecting what he saw as moral laxity, corruption, and un-Islamic customs among the Hausa ruling classes. By 1808, most Hausa city-states had been overtaken. Rulers were deposed, replaced with Fulani emirs loyal to the Caliphate's ideals. Islamic law became the foundation of governance. The new order emphasized Quranic scholarship, centralized taxation, and the systematic spread of Islam. Cities like Sokoto, Katsina, Kano became centers of Islamic learning, hosting scholars, libraries and debates on theology and law. Yet, beneath the reforms, layers of Hausa cultural memory endured, while court poetry now praised the caliph rather than kings of old. Echoes of Hausa idioms and customs persisted in the margins of jurisprudence and daily ritual. Traditional festivals, folklore, and dress codes remained embedded in the people's lives. Even if adapted to suit the new orthodoxy, the conquest had not erased the Hausa identity, it had reshaped it. Within a new theological frame, Segment 15, Language as Legacy, despite the political upheavals, the Hausa language itself proved an unshakable thread tying the past to the present. It was not merely a spoken medium, it became a literary force. After centuries of oral tradition, the Hausa people embraced writing with vigor, especially using the Ajami script Arabic letters modified for Hausa phonetics. Scribes composed histories, praise poetry, moral tales, and legal documents. The city of Kano became a literary capital, its scholars corresponding with peers across West Africa and the wider Islamic world. Even as colonialism later introduced the Latin alphabet and European education, Ajami remained a sacred and intellectual heritage. Hausa became a lingua franca across the soul, transcending ethnic boundaries. Traders, travelers, and scholars from different cultures used it to communicate. It was a unifying force, a cultural ambassador, and a vessel of continuity across shifting sands of power. Segment 16, Artisans of Time, in the heart of ancient Hausa cities. Artisans worked in sounds and silence, etching their culture into the materials of the earth. The tanners of Kano dyed hides in rich indigo blues and burnished reds, exporting leather to North Africa and beyond. Blacksmiths forged spears and plowshares, their furnaces a continuation of ironworking traditions stretching back over a millennium. Potters molded clay into vessels both sacred and mundane. Their art was more than economic, it was spiritual. Patterns carved into gourds or stamped into leather carried meanings of fertility, protection, and social status. Hausa embroidery, especially the elaborate Agbada robes of nobility, was an expression of identity, with motifs that told stories of lineage and power. Even architecture was an art form, walls painted with geometric designs, pillars incised with blessings, and entrances flanked by symbols invoking safety and prosperity. These artisans were custodians of memory through their hands. Generations spoke to one another across dynasties, conquests, and centuries. Their work remains one of the most enduring and tangible legacies of the Hausa world. Segment 17, The Women Who Remember. In every compound and courtyard, the elders, particularly women, served as vessels of tradition. Though history often privileges kings and emirs, it was the mothers, grandmothers, and matriarchs who carried the intimate, lived heritage of Hausaland. They preserved songs, herbal knowledge, kinship rules, and initiation rites. Through lullabies, dance, and storytelling, they planted the seeds of identity in each generation. During times of upheaval, colonial intrusion, jihad, famine, it was these women who reminded children who they were. They preserved pre-Islamic festivals in whispered forms, hid sacred songs in wedding chants, and taught folk medicine under the guise of everyday cooking. Their resilience was quiet, often invisible to outsiders, yet essential to the survival of Hausa cultural DNA. And they still remember. In villages and urban alleys, griot singers and wise women continue to shape the social rhythms celebrating birth, mourning loss, healing illness, and weaving the personal into the historical. Through them, the story of Hausaland remains not just in books, but in breath and memory. Segment 18, Trade Winds and Distant Horizons. The Hausa world was never isolated. From the golden sands of the Sahara to the dense forests of the Guinea savannah, Hausa merchants navigated wide commercial corridors, becoming vital links in trans-Saharan and regional trade networks. Their caravans, packed with dyed cloth, leather goods, colonnates, salt, and grain, crossed the desert toward Tripoli, Fez, and Cairo. In return, they brought back fine textiles, dates, glass beads, horses, and books of Islamic jurisprudence and poetry. Cities like Kano, Katsina, and Zaria were not merely political capitals. They were cosmopolitan marketplaces humming with voices in Arabic, Tuareg, Fulfulde, Kanuri, and Mand. Trade wasn't only about goods, it was also about ideas, beliefs, and technologies. The Hausa absorbed and exchanged architectural techniques, medicinal knowledge, religious commentary, and even styles of court etiquette. The commercial acumen of the Hausa was legendary. By the time European colonizers arrived in the 19th century, Hausa traders had already mapped much of West Africa. Their influence stretched far beyond Hausaland into the hinterlands of what is now Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, and even Sudan. In many regions today, Hausa is synonymous with merchant, and yet, trade for the Hausa was never just economic. It was a spiritual and cultural calling and opportunity. Why to carry identity, expand kinship networks, and serve the divine by engaging in honest commerce? The market was sacred and the merchant, a bridge between worlds. Segment 19, the colonial imprint. With the dawn of the 20th century, the sun set on Hausa political autonomy. British colonial forces swept into Hausaland under the banner of indirect rule. They were astounded by the sophistication of Hausa administration, taxation, and jurisprudence, and opted to rule through existing emirates, preserving their form but bending them to imperial will. Palaces once built for sovereign rulers became extensions of colonial bureaucracy. Emirs now answered to district commissioners. While Islam remained strong, Sufi brotherhoods were often viewed with suspicion, and Quranic schools were pressured to conform to Western educational models. Colonialism reshaped city layouts, introduced railroads and cash crops, and destabilized the intricate balance between traditional authority and communal decision-making. Hausa identity, once proudly self-defined, was now filtered through the lens of European ethnography and cartography, yet the Hausa spirit adapted. Resistance movements like the Zaria Rebellion in 1906 testified to a yearning for sovereignty. Writers and intellectuals began to reassert pride in Hausa history, penning books, plays, and songs in both Ajami and Roman scripts. Even under imperial control, the Hausa people never ceased to narrate their own story. Segment 20, the Hausa Renaissance. In post-colonial Nigeria and Niger, Hausa culture experienced a powerful revival. Hausa language cinema known as Kannywood emerged in Kano, producing hundreds of films per year and captivating audiences across West Africa, rooted in Hausa morality, family dynamics, and social issues. These stories became a modern continuation of the ancient griot tradition. Literature also flourished. Writers published novels and poetry in Hausa, English, and French, often blending Islamic themes with postmodern forms. Radio and television in Hausa reached millions, educating and entertaining in equal measure. In the diaspora from Ghana to Saudi Arabia, Hausa communities remained tightly knit, maintaining cultural rituals while engaging with global modernity. At the same time, traditional crafts found new audiences. Indigo-dyed fabrics, leather sandals, and Hausa embroidery began appearing in international fashion circles. Universities established Hausa studies departments. Scholars, historians, and artists proudly claimed their heritage and reconnected with ancient city-states as sources of inspiration. This was not nostalgia, it was cultural resilience. A renaissance rooted not in romantic idealism, but in the awareness that the past, when reclaimed and reimagined, becomes a map for the future. Segment 21, Echoes of the Walls. The mud walls of Zaria, Kano, and Katsina may crumble with time, but their echoes persist in the language spoken by tens of millions, in the architecture of family compounds, in the cadence of drumming at weddings and Eid festivals. They live on in the way an elder recites a proverb or a child greets with respect. To walk through Hausaland today is to move through layers of time, beneath the concrete and glass of modern skylines, beneath the noise of motorcycles and radios, lie the quiet foundations of cities that once stood proud. Behind defensive walls, strongholds of commerce, poetry, law, and faith. In these walls, generations sought protection. Within them, generations created legacies. And though empires fell and borders shifted, the cultural city-states of the Hausa endured adaptable, articulate, resilient. Their power was never just in bricks or battlements, but in ideas, and those ideas of hospitality, scholarship, faith, artistry, and justice remain as vital today as they were 1,000 years ago.